World's Evidence, a show meant to explore the world at its finest, at its worst, at its point in time, explore its history, talk about it in open discussion, and to explore its significance to us, political, sociological, and everything in between. I'm your host, Fareed, and today we're going to be talking about a numerous amount of things. This is World Evidence's first podcast, and be that as it may, I hope this serves its purpose into informing my listeners. This will be posted on several mediums, meant for non-commercial use under the Creative Commons license. Let's begin. Daily, I open my news sites. Google News seems to be the best aggregate news source for me, and I usually scroll down, skipping most of the US and the world news sources, mostly going into technology. And I say this because a lot of the world's problems can get lost in the advent of consumer technology. And technology being a political force in itself, we can't ignore the freedoms that it does give us, or the rights that can be stripped away from them. For example, net neutrality is still an issue. We can feel safe behind our computers, behind the internet, knowing that the information that we surf, the needs that we want fulfilled through the internet, music, movie streaming, television shows, aggregate news sources, such as Google News, such as Flipboard. These things are actually in threat, and I'm not advocating for more restrictions over the net. Libraries, for example, are free sources of information. If those are restricted, wouldn't that seem a bit fascist? And we've seen fascism throughout history. The control of information seems to be the most coveted power resource that any government would have. And aside even from government, let us assume that companies that provide us the information have a stake in such a deal. Would you want content to be controlled? The FCC has this in their hands, as they are in the news lately, discussing net neutrality rules. They're going to be releasing a proposal for, and I quote from Grant Gross on PC World in an article called So Long Net Neutrality. The FCC will release a proposal soon to reinstate net neutrality rules that will allow broadband providers to negotiate with content providers for preferential treatment. It almost seems like a company who provides you with the internet, an ISP, will have privileges for the amount they pay to the FCC to have certain privileges of what and what not to provide you, the user. Think of Google, one of the biggest content providers in the world at this time, and they provide several different outlets: video, music, web searches, different things. And recently, in their history of the company, they've been their own ISP. Now, be that as it may, they have only locations in Kansas and Texas. We can assume that their growth is substantial, and because they provide some, if not almost most, of the content on the internet, whether you search for it or you use their content, we can safely assume that with their billions of dollars, they could easily limit content from competitors, especially smaller ones, startups, for example, little companies that can't compete against their bigger counterparts, allowing the internet to finally be controlled by a certain number of people. Now, I'm not being an activist against net neutrality. This is not the purpose of this show. The purpose is to inform and to activate a discussion. And I could discuss this with my liberal point of views with you. Could it be a good thing or a bad thing, having your ISP control the content you deserve? We can look at the cable companies and what they do. How many times have they brought down the idea of a la carte programming? Because they want you to see what they want you to see in specific packages. And if you want something else on your lineup, you have to get a whole bunch of other channels that you're probably never going to watch. Media control at its finest. And it works as a business model. And if that works at the business end, could work in the government end as well. Let's look outside the United States or the European countries. What about the third world countries that have limited sources of information? In the past, 1980s, 1990s, when the internet was not even existing or at its infancy, most people got their news from radio, from television. Earlier than that, look towards the Cold War. America creates the Voice of America as a propaganda station broadcasting to countries not the United States as the voice of reason and of the free world. And a smaller country, maybe with a dictatorship, might have the same thing just for their citizens, feeding them disinformation, or selling them lies, or being influenced by their oligarchs, their rich company holders in their countries. North Korea may be a good example. Disinformation given to their citizens. And the opposite is true of their southern counterparts. South Korea feeding the public that their northern brothers are just as bad. It must be an awesome feeling to have control of such a resource and the way to manipulate it. Net neutrality will do the same. If you look outside the business model, if you set aside rules, your government can take it as well. There are ways to avoid it, and advocacy is one way. There are many ways, actually. You can probably avoid it, and those who do it illegally through VPNs, through using something called the Onion Network. Look it up. It's very intense. All to avoid the watchful eye of Big Brother. It's how the Arab Spring started. It's how many uprisings started, through even the French Revolution, right down to the fall of the Soviet Union. Big Brother has their hand over what you know, over what you listen to.
I'm ripping off spos, telling people I'm awesome because it's true. My satirical lyrics will knock you out of your shoes. I don't even worry about the fact that I'm white, cause all my lyrics are tight, so hand over the mic. Thank you. I'm bringing dope lyricism, beats coming at you hard enough to blow your whole music system. I lack wisdom, otherwise I wouldn't have used lyricism as the rhyme. Ism. Awesome is more than a title, it's a way of life, and you gotta be dedicated in order to do it right. I've got big shoes to fill, but I got big feet, the swagger of a Sasquatch when I'm walking down the street. Flipping sweet, I've got
Must have mentioned Russia a couple times, Soviet Union, and you can notice it becoming a bigger force in the world. Well, it's something you can't control. Governments rise and fall. They become stronger, they become weaker. In the world's view, Russia kind of never went anywhere. Being an Indian, I know that Russia's always been out for my country and my people. They have a relationship very, very close. But what if its leader, a relic from the old Soviet Union, the KGB, Vladimir Putin? Mysterious almost, how the man works. Definitely a relic, as most of the things he does in terms of world policy and the governments of his nation are very Soviet Union-like, missing the communism, of course. We can say that this fervent amount of nationalism this man has complements what we're missing in the West in itself. Certainly in this country that we live in, the United States, we've never been more patriotic. But contrast it with the Russians' form of patriotism. Look at Putin's form of patriotism compared to our Western leaders. It's an undying devotion. If you didn't know this already, Putin's actually single. His wife has divorced him, took their children with her. Why? Wasn't because the man cheated, had a sex scandal. But he did have an affair with Russia itself. How many leaders in this recent time, in this era, had an affair with their country? And those, strangely enough, that did have their affairs, their menagerie with their country, their secret infatuation with the place they were born from, they became the great ones. Throughout history, you'll see that many big names that have fervent love only to their country, it could almost be called selfish love for their country, they became the ones that were written in the history books. The ones that were written not for their country, but for themselves, who only amassed their own power. They were written poorly in the books of history. And it is a shame that politicians you'll see in Congress don't have that same fervor as Putin might have. Special interest groups, lobbies, they have a bigger grip over the nationalism of many people in Congress, whether on the left or on the right. That influence distorts patriotism. And I suppose you can be patriotic about gun rights, about abortion, about gay rights. That goes beyond the scope of what nationalism is, though. Putin knows this, I'm sure. He avoids those who pressure him into building a country for companies, big businesses, for the oligarchs. It probably explains why he's still there. And unfortunately, he does it through a very loopholed democratic system. But it's not like he's not doing a good job. No one's really suffering in his country. And you might see Ukraine as an example of his dark side. His dark side. If that is his dark side. Of course, that's all by perspective. All in the eye of the beholder, I would suggest. The Ukraine, Crimea, surrounding countries too, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, they were all part of the Soviet Union once. And a lot of those countries' remnants at this moment in time are Russian. And that's the discussion in the international world today. Where does Ukraine belong to? And the political motives are, of course, very profound. Many Western advocates would like to see an independent Ukraine, and the ones who seek a independent Ukraine in Ukraine want to join the Union, thus European Union. It's actually divided into half. And you will see that is a very distorted view on how to conquer this issue. Much like the issue is in Syria. The West supports a rebel movement to overthrow its president, Bashar al-Assad. And Russia, China, Iran, they prefer not to. It's a polarizing argument. An interesting point in our time in Europe and Asia that these things happen. And it's the involvement of other countries that allow these things to happen. I'm not talking about Western interests in the Middle East or the expansion of the European Union. I'm just talking about why we have to police lesser nations or bully once was superpowers because we have a dominant government system. I rather see the countries of lesser nations, third world nations, Middle East, Russia even, I just want to see them flourish and prosper. Mankind deserves contribution to the will of man, to the greater good for mankind to be fruitful, to discover. You can say that man gets in the way of his own evolution, of his own self-realization. Isn't it too much to ask to become better? Not better than the next person, but just better than the person we were before. As a race. The affairs of others, is it really necessary? And then we find Vladimir Putin, who stood quiet for the past 8 years at Russia, building it to become an economic powerhouse when it was a beggar's basket at one point when he became the head of state there. And he didn't get involved into anything until a year ago when his incursion into Georgia, and he reclaimed that country for his own and still gave them autonomy. I think mankind can learn from leaders that are willing to think about their country first, to love their country, to develop their nation because he sees their people as their children, and he sees his nation, his country, his flag as their father who gave birth to him. Perhaps someday we'll learn that aspect of our lives, to be tribes of a world nation even. Perhaps it's too much to ask for at this moment in time. This have been the first episode of World's Evidence. The name is currently a work in progress. I'm open to suggestions for names, and if you like any part of the show or like to be a part of the discussion, please do so in the comments below. I'll be entertaining you as well in the comments section. It's been a privilege to start this new project. I plan on bringing episodes on a weekly basis. So if you'd like to hear more content of the such, or if you'd like to hear another topic, or if you have any comments about the show that you'd like to make, please feel free, again in the comment section. I will be more than happy to listen to them. My name is Fareed. Have a wonderful day.